He never saw the gun, never heard the footsteps, never had a chance to scream. One moment he was walking outside, his breath visible in the cold night air. The next, bang! The shot echoed in the darkness. His body jerked. A second shot, closer this time. Blood pooled on the icy pavement, steam rising from the warmth of his fading life. Inside the house, laughter, clinking glasses, the countdown to midnight. But outside, Tyrone Hassel III lay dying. And the person who set his execution in motion? She was just on the other side of the door. New Year's Eve, a night of glittering lights, laughter, and resolutions for the year ahead. A time when families come together, sharing meals, clinking glasses, and holding loved ones a little closer as the countdown begins. But inside a quiet home in St. Joseph Township, Michigan, the final hours of 2018 carried a different weight. They carried secrets, deception, and a plan that would unravel a young soldier's life in an instant. Tyrone Hassel III was the kind of man people looked up to. Disciplined, kind, unwavering in his devotion to family and country. He had followed in his father's military footsteps, serving with honor in the United States Army. He was a husband, a father to a little boy who had only just begun to recognize his father's smile. Tyrone had come home on leave, eager to spend the holidays with his wife, Kimia, and their child, savoring the simple moments so many take for granted. But what should have been a night of celebration would instead become a night of horror. But before we go on, can you subscribe to our YouTube channel, like, and comment on the video? Just after 11 p.m., Tyrone stepped outside, his breath visible in the cold December air. Maybe he was grabbing food from the car. Maybe he was simply taking in a moment of solitude before the new year arrived. Whatever his reason, he never saw the shadowed figure approach, never had a chance to run, to fight, to beg for his life. A series of gunshots shattered the quiet suburban street. Neighbors later recalled hearing the pops, but it was New Year's Eve. Fireworks, they assumed. No reason to worry. But as the rest of the world counted down to midnight, one family's world was collapsing. Tyrone Hassel III wasn't just another soldier. He was the kind of man others naturally gravitated toward, disciplined, determined, and fiercely loyal. A natural leader, he didn't just wear the uniform, he embodied the values it stood for: respect, honor, duty. Following in his father's footsteps, he chose a life of service, dedicating himself to the military with an unwavering commitment. His superiors saw a future officer in the making. His fellow soldiers saw a man they could trust. But beyond the uniform, beyond the rigid discipline of military life, Tyrone was a family man. He had something many young soldiers long for: a wife to come home to, a baby boy to hold after long deployments. His world didn't just exist on foreign soil, in barracks or battle zones. His world was his family. Kimia Hassel, his wife, and their little son. This was what mattered most. To those who knew them from the outside, they had it all. A strong young couple navigating the challenges of military life together. Tyrone's social media posts painted the perfect picture. Smiling snapshots of fatherhood, loving tributes to his wife, proud moments in uniform. They were the kind of couple people admired, the kind of love story others envied. But photographs don't tell the whole truth. What the world saw was only one side of the story. Behind closed doors, behind carefully curated images, something else was unfolding. And on that fateful New Year's Eve, the illusion of perfection would shatter, exposing a darkness that no one saw coming. The air was still heavy with the sounds of celebration, fireworks crackling in the distance, laughter drifting from nearby homes. But on this quiet street in St. Joseph Township, there was only silence. A thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant wail of sirens cutting through the cold night air. The first officer on the scene stepped out of his patrol car, his breath curling in the winter chill as he took in the sight before him. Flashing red and blue lights washed over the suburban home, the glow reflecting off something dark, something wet, spreading across the frozen pavement. Tyrone Hassel III lay motionless, his body sprawled in an unnatural position. His eyes, once sharp, once full of life, were open but unseeing, his mouth slightly parted as if he had tried to speak one last word. But no words had come, only blood. The officer's radio crackled as backup arrived, but no amount of training could prepare them for this moment. The brutal stillness of a man who had just been living, breathing, walking, only to be cut down in an instant. The blood pooling beneath him, stark against the frost-covered ground, was still warm. He hadn't been gone long. Inside the house, his father sat unaware, wrapped in the glow of the television, the sounds of New Year's Eve celebrations masking the horror just outside his door. The countdown to midnight had begun. The world was on the verge of a fresh start. But for the Hassel family, time had just stopped. Detectives arrived, their boots crunching against the ice as they approached the body. Their eyes scanned the area, cataloging the details, but something felt off. The scene didn't make sense. It had all the markings of a robbery, except for the most crucial ones. A robbery would have meant a struggle, missing items, chaos. Instead, Tyrone's wallet remained tucked in his pocket. His phone still in his hand, the screen cracked but unshattered. His keys right there beside him. Nothing had been taken except his life. The wounds were clean, precise. The shots hadn't been fired in panic or desperation. They had been methodical, planned. Whoever had pulled the trigger hadn't been after money or valuables. They had been after Tyrone. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something much darker, a targeted execution. The realization settled over the investigators like a weight, pressing against their chests. This wasn't random. It wasn't the work of a stranger lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity. Number. The gunman had known exactly when and where to strike. They had waited. They had watched. They had made sure Tyrone was alone, vulnerable, with no chance to escape. And the most unsettling truth of all, the person who had orchestrated it was much closer than anyone could have imagined. Grief is unpredictable. It doesn't follow rules. It doesn't unfold neatly. It crashes over people in violent, uncontrollable waves. Gasping sobs, trembling hands, voices breaking under the weight of loss. But as detectives sat across from Kamaya Hassel, watching her carefully, something felt off. Her sorrow was present, but it lacked the raw edges of devastation. No chokeback sobs, no hands shaking uncontrollably, no moments where her composure shattered under the gravity of losing her husband. Instead, she sat with a quiet stillness, her words measured, controlled, almost rehearsed. At first, they reasoned with themselves. Not everyone grieves the same way. Some people shut down, overwhelmed by shock. Others compartmentalize, clinging to logic because the alternative, falling apart, is too unbearable. But as the hours dragged on and the questions deepened, so did a nagging unease. Something wasn't right. When Kamaya spoke about Tyrone, her tone remained eerily steady. There were no unexpected flickers of emotion, no hesitations, no moments where memories overwhelmed her. It was as if she had already told this story 100 times before, as if she had practiced every word. Detectives studied her closely, noting every shift in her posture, every calculated pause, every moment when her eyes should have been filled with sorrow but weren't. They had seen grief in its purest, most agonizing form before. The inconsolable wails of a mother losing a child, the trembling hands of a father forced to identify his son's body. But Kamaya? She was different. Her face remained dry, her breathing even. She never lost control, never seemed consumed by the unbearable weight of tragedy. If anything, she seemed prepared. And then there were the inconsistencies. Tiny at first, small contradictions in her timeline, insignificant on their own, but piling up with each retelling. A moment she recalled too precisely, a detail she fumbled, then quickly corrected. A gap in time that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't enough to accuse her, not yet, but something deep in the detective's instincts, a gut feeling honed through years of experience, told them one undeniable truth. Kamaya Hassel wasn't just grieving, she was hiding something. A gut feeling isn't enough to build a case. Detectives knew that. Suspicion alone wouldn't put a killer behind bars. They needed more than instincts, more than a hunch. They needed proof, concrete, undeniable evidence that couldn't be twisted, couldn't be explained away. And so they turned to the one place where even the best-kept secrets leave a trace: Tyrone Hassel's phone records. It didn't take long for something to stand out. A number. One that appeared again and again. Text messages, calls. Late-night conversations stretched for hours. And when detectives ran the number, a name came back. Jeremy Cuellar, a fellow soldier. Someone who should have been nothing more than a colleague. But Jeremy wasn't just another name in Kamaya's contact list. He wasn't just a friend, wasn't just a casual acquaintance. He was more than that. He was her lover. As investigators dug deeper, the web of deception grew larger, darker. This wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just an affair hidden behind hushed conversations and stolen moments. It was something far worse. In the days leading up to Tyrone's murder, Kamaya and Jeremy had been in near constant communication. The messages were chilling in their simplicity, carefully worded but unmistakable in meaning. They spoke in codes, in half-sentences. But when detectives lined up the timestamps of their texts with Tyrone's final moments, the truth became undeniable. Tyrone had stepped outside into the cold, into the darkness of his own driveway, completely unaware that the woman he trusted the most had already signed his death warrant. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a moment of blind rage or reckless impulse. It was a plan, a calculated betrayal, and at the center of it all, pulling the strings, ensuring that every move was perfectly executed, was Tyrone Hassel. Murder isn't always impulsive. Sometimes it's methodical, meticulous, calculated down to the second. And in this case, it was all of that and more. The plan was disturbingly simple, too simple, and that's what made it so chilling. Jeremy Cuellar was the trigger man. But the orders, those came from Kamaya. She had spent weeks poisoning his mind, whispering in his ear, feeding him the same twisted narrative over and over again until it became his truth. Tyrone was the problem. Tyrone was the obstacle. Tyrone was the thing standing between them and the life they deserved. She played the role perfectly. The helpless wife, trapped, suffocating, desperate for escape. She convinced Jeremy that she was the victim, that the only way out was to remove the man who had promised to love her forever. Jeremy didn't hesitate. He didn't question. He didn't see the deception beneath her words. He believed her, and he was willing to kill for her. The details had been worked out long before New Year's Eve. They knew Tyrone's schedule. They knew his habits. They knew that after celebrating with family, he'd step outside for just a moment, long enough to grab food from the car. That would be the moment. The moment he'd be alone, the moment he'd be vulnerable. Jeremy lay in wait, hidden in the darkness just beyond the driveway. The street was quiet. The only sounds were distant echoes of fireworks, bursts of laughter from homes still filled with celebration. A world blissfully unaware that in this very instant, a man was about to die. The door opened. Tyrone stepped outside. He never even had the chance to turn around. A flash of movement, a figure emerging from the shadows. Then, the first shot, a thunderous crack splitting through the night. Tyrone staggered, confusion flashing across his face before pain took over. The second shot, he collapsed. His body hit the ground, the fresh frost beneath him turning dark, turning red, the warmth of his life spilling out onto the frozen pavement. Jeremy didn't linger, didn't hesitate. There was no second guessing, no moment of remorse. Within seconds, he was gone. The only thing left behind was the body of a man who never saw it coming. At first, it seemed like the perfect crime. No witnesses, no security footage, no immediate suspects. A robbery gone wrong, that's what everyone thought. That's what Kamaya wanted them to think. But disappearances don't last forever. And secrets, they always find a way out. Authorities followed the digital breadcrumbs, tracing messages, tracking locations, unraveling a web of deception, and at the center of it, Kamaya and Jeremy. It wasn't long before they found him. Cornered and desperate, Jeremy tried to hold out. He thought he could stay silent, thought he could lie his way out. But under the weight of the evidence, of the truth, his confidence shattered. And when he finally spoke, what he revealed sent a chill down the spines of even the most seasoned detectives. This wasn't just a murder. This was cold-blooded execution. And worse, this was betrayal. Deeper, more insidious. more calculated than anyone could have imagined. Justice isn't always swift, but when it arrives, it is absolute. The courtroom was heavy with tension, thick enough to feel in the air. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the polished wood and solemn faces. Every seat in the gallery was filled, some by reporters scribbling notes, some by strangers drawn in by the sheer horror of the case. And then there were those who truly mattered. Tyrone's family, his brothers in arms, the people who had loved him, who had trusted that the justice system would not fail him the way his own wife had. Kamaya Hassel sat at the defense table, hands neatly folded in her lap, her posture eerily composed. There were no tears, no nervous glances, no signs of regret. If she felt any guilt, it was buried deep beneath the same cold detachment that had allowed her to orchestrate her husband's murder. She barely flinched as the prosecution laid out its case. The messages exchanged between her and Jeremy Cuellar, the phone calls, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the secret planning, the moments where she had the chance to stop, where she could have chosen a different path. And yet she never did. A calculated execution, a betrayal more intimate than any wound inflicted by a stranger. The jury saw it all, heard it all, and the more they listened, the clearer the picture became. Jeremy Cuellar sat nearby, his once unwavering devotion to Kamaya reduced to nothing. His head remained low, shoulders hunched forward, as if the weight of his choices had finally settled upon him. He had done what she asked, pulled the trigger, snuffed out a life that wasn't his to take, and now he sat there, waiting to learn his fate. When the prosecution made its final statement, there was no doubt left in the room. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an act of impulse. This was premeditated, planned down to the finest detail. Kamaya had wanted her husband dead for one reason: money, his military benefits, the life insurance payout, the promise of a fresh start with her lover. She had mapped it all out, certain that no one would ever suspect her, certain that she could weep at his funeral and walk away untouched. She had calculated everything, except for one thing. The truth has a way of surfacing. The moment the verdict was read, the courtroom fell into eerie silence. Guilty. Kamaya barely reacted. She remained still, her expression unreadable. But for those who had waited, for those who had spent months grappling with the unbearable truth, the words landed like a final, irreversible blow. First-degree murder. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. There were no outbursts, no last-minute pleas for mercy, no dramatic displays of emotion, only the sound of justice being served. Tyrone Hassel III had his future stolen in a moment of brutal betrayal. And now the people who had taken his life had lost their own. But justice, no matter how final, could never bring him back. And for those who loved him, the pain of that loss would never fade. A father should never have to bury his son. But on a bitter January morning, Tyrone Hassel Jr. found himself doing exactly that. The wind cut through the cemetery, howling low and mournful, as if the earth itself was grieving. The sky hung heavy, a dull gray that matched the weight in every heart gathered that day. Rows of uniformed soldiers stood motionless, their faces unreadable, their backs rigid with the discipline ingrained in them. But behind their stoicism was sorrow. At the front of it all, Tyrone Jr. stood, his fingers gripping the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had rehearsed his words in his mind, but now, staring at the sea of grieving faces, the weight of his loss pressed against his chest like an unbearable force. His son's name was printed in bold, final letters on the program clutched in his trembling hands. Tyrone Hassel III, a name that should have had decades more to be spoken, a name that should have been called out in laughter, in pride, in love, a name that should still belong to a man standing here among the living. But now it would only be whispered in grief, and soon it would be etched in stone. Tyrone Jr. swallowed hard, his throat tightening around a grief too vast to contain. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked, raw with sorrow. The army lost a good soldier. I lost a good son. The words barely made it past the lump in his throat. They hung in the air, heavy, irreversible. Tyrone Jr. had watched his son grow from a bright-eyed, determined boy into a disciplined, honorable man. a man who answered the call to serve his country, who worked tirelessly to build a future for his family. A man who loved deeply without hesitation, and in return he had been betrayed in the most unimaginable way, by the person he trusted most. His wife clutched his arm, her sobs silent but unrelenting. Around them, friends and family members dabbed at tear-streaked faces, their grief raw and unfiltered. Soldiers shifted on their feet, their chins trembling ever so slightly as they struggled to maintain their composure. A folded American flag was presented to the family, crisp and precise, a symbol of honor, a symbol of sacrifice, a symbol of service. But it was just that, a symbol. It couldn't replace the man they had lost. It couldn't fill the hollow ache left behind in their hearts. And yet, through all the sorrow, the disbelief lingered. How? How could someone betray the person who trusted them the most? How could love, something meant to nurture, to protect, turn into something so ruthless, so calculated, so cruel? No one had an answer. Only grief and silence. Tyrone Hassel III lived a life of service, not just to his country, but to the people who mattered most, his family, his friends, his brothers in arms. He was the kind of man others looked up to, not just because of the uniform he wore, but because of the integrity he carried with him every single day. To his fellow soldiers, he was a leader, the kind of man who didn't just follow orders, but inspired those around him. In the military, you learn quickly who you can trust, who you'd want beside you when everything is on the line. Tyrone was that person, the one who never hesitated, the one who showed up. To his friends, he was the steady hand, the calming voice, the one who would drop everything if you needed him, the kind of man who never turned his back on the people he loved. And to his family, he was everything. A devoted son who carried the lessons his father taught him, a doting father whose eyes lit up whenever he spoke about his little boy, a husband who believed in the promise of forever, but forever never came. The very person he trusted with his heart, the woman he had vowed to love and protect, was the one who stole his future without hesitation. Kamaya smiled in family photos. She held his hand in public. She whispered promises of love. And behind closed doors, she orchestrated his murder. Every glance, every touch, every kiss. It had all been a lie, a mask hiding something darker. She knew exactly what she was doing. She played the role of the loving wife while she manipulated another man into pulling the trigger. She planned it down to the second. She watched as Tyrone walked toward his death, never once warning him that the woman he trusted more than anyone had already decided his fate. It's a chilling reality, one that reminds us of a painful truth. Betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people we let in, the ones we never question, the ones we never suspect. A man like Tyrone should have seen his son grow up. He should have had decades of memories ahead of him. More laughter, more milestones, more moments that mattered. Instead, his story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that love, when twisted by greed, can turn into something deadly. But despite everything, Tyrone Hassel III isn't defined by the crime that took him. His name isn't just another case file. His legacy lives on. In the son who will grow up knowing that his father was a man of honor, in the soldiers who still remember the brother they lost, in the family that refuses to let his memory fade into the background of another statistic. Tyrone Hassel III was more than a victim. He was a father, a soldier, a man who deserved so much more than the fate that awaited him on that cold December night. What do you think is missing in this story? Do you think Tyrone's father deserved this fate? The comment section is open. Thank you for remembering Tyrone with us. His story should never be forgotten. Subscribe for more chilling stories like this, because this is one of the only ways we keep those stories alive from fading into the everyday busy life.